Hi there, this is a tutor to you MCQ revision blast for biopsychology for the AQA A Level. This is test number 5, so be sure to check out the other tests that we've got on here too. In terms of how this works, there's going to be 15 questions that we've selected from Biopsych. Now these are in the MCQ format, so multiple choice, not necessarily the kind of multiple choice questions you might see in the exam. We've just used this format because it's a nice way for you to interact. So the questions will come up, I'll read through the questions and then pause the video. I'll run through the answers and do a bit of talking around a few particular topics. So keep your score as you go along. You'll see in a lot of this in the video there's a lot of screenshots as well of diagrams and stuff. If you want copies of these are from the Tutor to You Psychopathology Revision Companion. Off we go. Question 1. Which of the following does not describe the central nervous system? So A, the brain is part of it, B, contains somatic and autonomic, C, the spinal cord is part of it, or D, it's part of the nervous system. So pause the video and think of your answer. Right, the correct answer here is B, so that does not describe the central nervous system. So the diagram that's here on the slide details one component of the nervous system, and that's the central nervous system. So your central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And within the brain, like you can see on that diagram, there's many different regions. For example, we've got the occipital lobe, which is very important for vision, the temporal lobe, which processes auditory information, the parietal lobe, which brings together information from the senses, so it's really important in spatial navigation. The frontal lobe, which is involved in what we call higher order functions like planning and logic. And then at the bottom there you've got the brain stem, and that's what connects the brain to the spinal cord. And within the spinal cord, that transfers kind of back and forth from brain to body and is involved in what we call reflex actions, like quickly pulling your hand out of a fire. Okay, on to question number 2. Which of these is not a description of the peripheral nervous system? So A, split into autonomic and somatic, B, relays nerve impulses from CNS to the body, C, connects the brain and spinal cord, D, parasympathetic and sympathetic branches. So which is not a description of the PNS? So pause the video. Okay, your correct answer there is C. Now, if you were listening to me in the last one, you picked up that C there is actually the brain stem, so it connects the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the main function of the peripheral nervous system is B there. That's to say relaying nerve impulses from the CNS to the rest of the body. Now, your peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic, which is basically communication between the CNS and the outside world, and the autonomic nervous system. Now, within the autonomic, there's two branches to it. We've got the sympathetic, which is involved in fight or flight, and we'll come on to that later on. And then we've got the parasympathetic, and that's involved in relaxation, so returning your body to a normal resting state. So when you're parasympathetic, you're nice and relaxed, your breathing and heart rate are nice and gentle, and when you switch over to the sympathetic branch, your breathing increases, heart rate goes up, etc. Some other changes that we'll look at within that shortly. Okay, on to the third question. Which type of neuron is described here? Found in the CNS, they control muscle movements. Is it A, a relay neuron, B, an action neuron, C, a sensory neuron, or D, a motor neuron? So pause the video. Right, the correct answer there is D. So the question is, what do you need to know about neurons for the exam? Well, on the specification it says the structure and function of sensory, relay and motor neurons. Action neuron there, number B, I just threw in and made it up. So the idea is they all have similar parts, and that's detailed on that diagram you can see there. But as you can see, the parts are actually organised differently. Now, in terms of what they do, sensory neurons we refer to as afferent neurons, and these are found in receptors like your eyes, ears and skin. And what they do is they carry a nerve impulse to the spinal cord and the brain. So they travel from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. Some only go as far as the spinal cord. Motor neurons are what we call efferent neurons, and they're in the CNS. They control the movement of muscles. Now, the axon of a motor neuron projects into the spinal cord, or it can actually travel all the way into muscle and glands. The longest axon in the human body actually stretches from the base of your spine right down to a muscle in your big toe. So it's about 1 meter long. Relay neurons are found between sensory input and a motor response. So they're in the brain and spinal cord and allow communication between motor and sensory neurons. So if you think about it, what I've just gone through there is pictorially, structurally what they look like, and then what I've just detailed there is the functions of each of those types of neurons. Question 4. Which term for synaptic transmission do students often neglect to include in their description? Summation, synapse, action potential, neurotransmitters. So pause the video. Okay, the correct answer here is A. Now, this particular part of the specification is called the process of synaptic transmission, including reference to neurotransmitters, excitation and inhibition. So summation here, which is the correct answer, links to excitation and inhibition. And in previous exam series, this has been a real problem area for students, especially when discussing excitation and inhibition. It was actually stated in the exam report that the understanding of summation was rare, even in the best answers that they had. Right, so how does this work? So some neurotransmitters are excitatory, and these make the postsynaptic cell more likely to fire. And some are inhibitory, and these make the postsynaptic cell less likely to fire. Now, don't fall into the trap of saying that excitation causes more neurotransmitter and inhibition less. That's not how it works. So what happens is when a neuron receives an excitatory and or inhibitory input at the same time, it basically needs to make a calculation to decide whether or not it's going to fire. So it's doing like a little sum, get it? Summation. If the number of excitatory inputs are greater than the number of inhibitory inputs, then this results in the generation of what we call an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So let's say a neuron receives 7 excitatory inputs and 3 inhibitory, then excitatory wins. So summation is about summing those excitatory and inhibitory impulses. 5. Which of these describes the endocrine system? So you've got A, relays messages from CNS to rest of body, B, provides conscious awareness, C, network of glands, D, electrochemical messengers. So pause the video. The correct answer there is C. It might be you pausing it now and seeing if you can think of what the other terms are there. The other terms there are A, relieves messages from the CNS to rest of body is the PNS, provides conscious awareness is the brain, and electrochemical messengers are neurotransmitters. So the endocrine system is basically a network of glands, like it says there in C, and these glands are found all throughout your brain and body, and they secrete chemical messengers which we call hormones. Now these chemical messengers are transmitted throughout the bloodstream, and there's a number of glands and the releasing hormones from these glands that you need to be aware of in order to be able to really describe what the endocrine system does, that we'll have a look at in this next question. Here we go. Which of the following is not a gland in the endocrine system? So A, pituitary, B, ovaries, C, pineal, or D, limbic. So which is not a gland in the endocrine system? Pause the video. Right, your correct answer there is limbic. So let's take a bit of a look now at the endocrine system. So what do you need to know about it? Well, you need to know what it is that we went through in the previous question, and then for a number of the glands you need to be aware of what hormones they release and the effect that these hormones have. So that's why we've got this nice kind of chart here that summarises it. So let's pick out a few examples. You've got the pineal gland, which secretes the hormone melatonin, and that's responsible for the sleep-wake cycle. We'll come on to that later when we look at biological rhythms. The master gland, which is the pituitary gland, so we call the pituitary gland the master gland as it controls the functions of the other endocrine glands. It's like the most important. The pituitary is broken down into the anterior, which is the front of, and the posterior, which is the rear. At the front of the pituitary gland, ACTH is released, and this is an important hormone for the stress response. And in the rear of the pituitary gland, we have the release of oxytocin, which is an important hormone for childbirth. So in terms of questions in this area, think about questions asking you to outline a gland from the endocrine system and its function, perhaps a larger 6-mark question on describing the functions of the endocrine system. And in that kind of question, think carefully about the kind of glands that you're going to refer to in your answer. Just an interesting fact here, this is a hagfish. Now a hagfish is a vertebrate species that doesn't have a pineal gland, and it makes it very, very rare. Question 7. Put these into the correct order for the fight or flight response. So e.g. you might say A, then B, then C, then D. So which happens first, second, third and fourth in the fight or flight response? So pause the video. Okay, the correct answer there should be D, B, C, then A. And here's just a nice little diagram just to summarise it. So the fight or flight response, what is it? Because we've all heard of it. Basically, when you're put in a stressful situation, the amygdala, which is part of your limbic system, is activated. What the amygdala does is it responds to sensory input, so the things we can see, hear, smell, etc. And it connects those sensory inputs with emotions. So for example, emotions associated with fight or flight, like fear and anger. Now, if you're in a situation and it's deemed as a stressful or dangerous situation, the amygdala sends a distress signal to your hypothalamus. That then communicates with the body through the sympathetic nervous system. If the situation requires a short-term response from the sympathetic nervous system, that's where the sympathomedullary pathway, the SAM pathway, is activated, which triggers the fight or flight response, and that's where we see the release of adrenaline. Okay, so with your fight or flight response, it is useful to think about the order in terms of which things happen in it. Question 8. Which of the following is not caused by activation of the sympathetic nervous system? So pupil dilation, sweat production, decreased digestion, or increased salivation, so which is not caused by activation of the SNS. Pause the video. Right, your correct answer there is D, increased salivation. Now, this is actually a really important question because one of the things that's named on the specification is about the role of adrenaline, and that's really what we're talking about here. So in terms of adrenaline, it has a number of different physiological effects on your body, and we've got them basically listed here. The reason that you get these changes with adrenaline is to prepare your body for either fight or flight. So a number of things are increased, like your heart rate, sweat production, but we also have the reduction of what we call non-essential functions. Think about it, your body's going to need a lot of energy, and to find that energy, it has to divert its resources from other places. Now, when your fight or flight response is over, you switch back onto that parasympathetic side. Then what happens is your body returns back to its normal resting state. So your parasympathetic nervous system will slow down your heart rate, your breathing, etc. Okay, question 9. Damage to the motor cortex in the left hemisphere will result in. So A, B, C or D. Pause the video. All right, your correct answer there is B. So we're just going to run through a few things that kind of on this side. We'll start with Broca's and Wernicke's area. So Broca's and Wernicke's area, they're both in the left temporal lobe. We often use the term language centre to describe this area. Now Broca's area is involved in speech production and Wernicke's area in speech understanding. We call damage to these areas Broca's or Wernicke's aphasia. But of course with this question it was talking about the motor cortex, so they're not relevant to this answer. But in regards to the motor cortex, that appears in both your left and your right hemispheres. With the motor cortex, we use this term contralateral control. What that means is the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. The right side of your brain, so your right hemisphere, controls the left side of your body. So if a person damages the left motor cortex, and the motor cortex is involved in things like voluntary movement, what then we'd see is impaired movement on the right side of their body. And we pulled this question out in particular because in previous exam series where students have been asked about the motor cortex, they've really struggled to demonstrate knowledge of what the motor cortex actually was. Question 10. Which of these statements is not related to plasticity and functional recovery? So which is not related? So pause the video. Right, the correct answer there is A. So hemispheric, because A is hemispheric lateralization. Brain's plasticity is basically your brain's ability to change and adapt over time due to experience. So your brain is an ever-changing organ. Functional recovery is really cool. It's the brain's ability to recover after trauma. And what it does is it transfers functions from one area of the brain, so a damaged area of the brain, into another area. And the great thing is you don't even have to ask it to do this. The way that it does this can be through what we call neuronal unmasking. And this is where dormant synapses begin to open connections to compensate for damaged areas. Okay. Question 11. Which of these is not a method of study in the brain that's listed on the specification? So which is not listed on the specification? Okay, correct answer there is B, MRI. Now also listed on your specification is postmortem. We'll just give you a bit of word of warning with this area though. Although postmortem is listed as a method of study in the brain, so of course you have to know about it in detail. When there's been a more open-ended question in terms of methods of study in the brain and students have used postmortem, they often haven't done it very well, so they've really struggled to show knowledge of what it was and do any detailed evaluation should they be asked to. Now, if you are asked to evaluate these methods, a really nice route you could go down for that evaluation is you could talk about comparison between them and methods not named on the spec, for example, MRI or PET scan. The reason that I'm suggesting this is just because where students have done this in the examination, they've often done very well in terms of their AO3. Question 12. Which of these descriptions of FMRI is incorrect? So A, B, C or D. So pause the video. Okay, so the correct answer there is C. Now, knowing, and we do know this, that students often struggle to give detailed descriptions of the methods used to study the brain, it's really useful for you to go over the key details of each one. So here we've broken it down into outline, invasive or non-invasive, and the temporal and spatial revolution. Now, the really nice thing about doing it in this way is this then leads you to a really nice basis should you be asked to compare them. So you compare them in terms of the outline, that's to say what they actually do, whether they're invasive or non-invasive, and also the temporal spatial resolution. Because remember, you can also be asked about similarities and differences in terms of these different methods to study the brain. All right, 13, which two from the four below relate to infradian rhythms? So have a read through. I want two of those. So pause the video. Right, correct answer there is C and A. Now these are your biological rhythms. So you've got infradian, circadian and ultradian. They're all named on your specification. The circadian is the 24-hour rhythm. So we sometimes refer to this as the biological clock, and it's reset by levels of light. So sleep-wake cycle and temperature are both examples of circadian rhythms. The infradian rhythms last longer than 24 hours, so they could be weekly, monthly, yearly. A classic example of an infradian rhythm is the menstrual cycle, but we've also included on here seasonal affective disorder, which is changes in mood depending on the season. And then finally, the ultradian rhythms last less than 24 hours. We see these, for example, in patterns of human sleep, so the alternation between rapid eye movement and non-rapid eye movement in the cycles of sleep. Question 14. Which of these is an endogenous pacemaker? Read them carefully. Which of them is an endogenous pacemaker? So pause your video. Okay, your correct answer there is C. So suprachiasmatic nucleus, if you got fooled by the supercalifragilistic nucleus there. So SCN. Now, endogenous pacemakers are internal mechanisms and they govern biological rhythms. The most important endogenous pacemaker that we have is the SCN, and it's linked to the pineal gland in the circadian sleep-wake cycle. So how does it work? So the SCN is in the hypothalamus, and it gets information about the levels of light from the optic nerve, and this then synchronizes the circadian rhythm with the outside world, that's to say day and night. Now, the SCN communicates with the pineal gland, which leads to an increase in melatonin. Remember, we came across this when we looked at the endocrine system, and melatonin helps to induce sleep. On to the final question. Which of these statements is not related to exogenous zeitgebers? So A, B, C or D. Pause your video. Correct answer there is C, because C is an endogenous pacemaker. So exogenous zeitgebers affect biological rhythms, and these are best thought of as being external, hence the EX on the name. So these are events that reset the biological clock of an organism. So we've got things like meal times, but really the most important exogenous zeitgeber is light, which resets the body clock. So the light interacts with the SCN, which we spoke about as part of endogenous pacemakers. Okay, just finish off then with a few top tips for biopsych. Terminology is obviously very, very important within biopsych, as we've demonstrated as we've gone along this MCQ BAST. Don't be scared of the biology. Students have done very well on biopsych in the past, so you can get to grips with it. Know your spec inside out is always important for any area in psychology. And just be careful with application questions. You go beyond just mentioning the name of a person if given in the STEM in your answer. So good luck.